Tom, up front, just thank you very much. You are a very busy man now that you are in retirement for a while already. So I'm just glad that you were swift with your response when I had, fired the shot across the bow, It was more like a shot in the dark, but I thought, let me try because there's so much convergence here for me over a 50-year window of the can of worms that you've never closed since you started out in ministry. Uh, so I'm just so grateful that you can make it because, and I don't want to spend maximum time rehashing a lot of stuff here. I think as I've watched your videos, just so much convergence. I'm trying hard to find something that I'm vehemently disagreeing with.
So what, just so you know that we can
We
now
are
see you.
recording. Oh, okay. Oh, great stuff.
Yes.
Theo, is that background okay, or should I kill it?
I don't know, if it can die a peaceful death, yes.
I can do that.
I don't know. It's
Okay. It's okay.
yeah.
It's okay. Uh, so, Tom, our starting points are very similar. I come out of a background very strongly influenced by Brethrenism, and very early in my Christian life, as a late teenager, I started firing the questions, and my entry point was quite different than yours, as you were wrestling with, what's this thing? What's worship? What does the New Testament picture look like? What is edification all about according to 1 Corinthians 14? Mine was more from an angle of how do elders function within the body and what role and part do they play in edification? And of course, the knock-on effect of that was huge for me because I experienced some of the same alienation that you did. Was turned down for a ministry opportunity to plant a local church because of my views on eldership and viewing it more as, we function together within the context of community to edify. So with that as a common starting point, I want us to work through the questions that I had put to you, just as to give some direction, because I followed almost all of your videos that you've been putting out since the 7 series of videos came out. I thought, my goodness me, I wish I had this 50 years ago, kind of thing. But let's start out with that first question, Tom. What's wrong with worship?
Yeah, okay. Well, great question, and it's great to be with you, Terry. The question is kind of convoluted, if I may boldly say so. We need to define what we mean by this word worship. As it turns out, there are at least 5 different Greek words in our New Testament that are translated as worship. So when you say, what's wrong with worship? Do you mean what's wrong with proskuneo worship? Or do you mean what's wrong with latruo worship? Or what's wrong with liturgeo worship? Or what's wrong with sebomai worship? Or what's wrong with threskeia worship? As it turns out, all 5 of these words, which are at various times translated as worship, mean something different. None of these words are synonymous, and yet to read our English Bibles would make you think that they must be, but they are in fact not. Each one has a different meaning. Let's take proskuneo, for example, which I did the most amount of work in research and trying to figure out what this thing means. This word refers to the ritual act of prostrating oneself before either a deity or before another human being who is deemed to be of greater importance in one way or another. So when you ask about what's wrong with worship, are you asking what's wrong with prostration? And I don't think that's your question at all. I think what your question probably is, what's wrong with what we're doing in our assemblies? Would that be
Absolutely
true?
right. Absolutely right. Within the 1 or 2 hour slot on a Lord's Day morning.
Yeah.
Because that's
Yes.
basically defined as that's worship. That's we're being serviced by worship within these four walls. And of course, very early for me, I started having quite an acidic reaction to that, because I'm figuring, why is it that we are so anemic as the people of God? First thing that struck me was, this difficulty with being able to dialogue in the marketplace. Why can't we do that? And yet, when we get into the worship service, it seems to be this monological approach, which is one way only. No room for questions, no room for freedom of thinking, freedom of speaking, which is part of what edification is all about. And so, just listening to you through those 7 videos was, again, just such an affirmation of what we are missing in the building up, in what you call the one anothering. I just like the way you've turned the one another's into a verbal idea versus a nominal idea. This is this thing. Well, this is what we should actually be doing. So talk to us some into that, about how one anothering fits into that whole aspect.
Yeah. Let me back up again to your first question. What's wrong with this thing we call worship? To, to get a fundamental understanding of what the Christian assembly is all about in the New Testament, we need to start using, well, first century New Testament words to describe it, or else we're going to get off kilter. And worship is the wrong word to use because it sends us in the wrong direction as to what the whole meeting was about. As it turns out, none of those 5 words that I described earlier that are translated as worship, none of them are used in the context of a Christian assembly in the New Testament. They don't really talk about, those words are not talking about things they did in the assembly. So that's part of our big problem here, getting our head around it. But what is a concept that does help to get our head around what first century Christian assemblies was about is, well, you mentioned the word edification. That certainly is good. But the other word you mentioned, which is really important, is one another. The one anothering aspect of the first century assemblies is a crucial and critical difference between what was going on then and what's going on now. Because in a modern worship context, we don't think about one anothering. We think about monologuing, one person at the front who is commanding control of everything, and he is the one who is authorized and is the knowledgeable one to share his great wisdom with the rest of us, which really, in effect, denies that the Holy Spirit is active and present within all of God's people, all of his children there in that same assembly. And what a crime it is, I think, to shut up all those other people, to not hear what God has revealed to them, or what the Spirit is saying within them, or what they have learned in their own studies, which is equally valid, or which is valid and helpful to the rest of us. Yet, boy, we just don't get it. Our assemblies are built on this worship, this false worship premise, which once we understand that the premise is wrong, the premise is faulty, the premise is not biblical, then we can begin to build. And one of the principles, I'll say this one more thing, then I'll shut up. One of the principles that's important on any biblical issue is to start with the Bible and build your understanding of that topic, whatever it is. Do not start with your doctrine and then defend it. If you take that approach, you'll be heading in the wrong direction almost every time, because you're starting with a presumption that our doctrine is in fact correct, which can be proven that it's just flat out not. And I think I have flat out proven that this worship concept that we have is in fact not biblical, and that's actually quite simple to prove. It doesn't take anybody with a PhD or anybody with knowledge of Greek and Hebrew to figure that out. It's right there in everybody's Bible.
Absolutely.
So with that, that, I'll
Yep.
shut up and turn it back over to you, Terry.
Well, I did a speed read about 3 days ago. I got hold of your dissertation, and I did a speed read through the 300 plus pages. And I must tell you that I have not come across anything where I would say, I vehemently disagree with this brother. Now, I thought myself foolish for not being able to stumble on any of that, because all of it has had such a resonance with me in terms of how we ought to be edifying the body. And that's why when I came up with the second question, this whole way of thinking about the assembly, if we're thinking about the assembly from a biblical perspective, the way the chapters in First Corinthians, for example, starting out in verse number 17 of First Corinthians 11 already, he's talking about when you get together. I know your big sort of hinge point was First Corinthians 14, looking at how the two speaking gifts functioned within an edifying context. Well, for years, I've been wrestling through the 4 chapters because it starts out in 11 and goes right through to 14. And then you get into the rest of Paul's letters, for example, in Ephesians 4, where he's talking about, how the broadcast model now morphs into, as we mature, into this mutual edification, peer on peer kind of modality. I don't use the word model because every model is wrong. Some are useful, but as an amoebic modality that's alive. And how would you respond to that? That thinking about the assembly from a biblical perspective and not from my ideological perspective, from my doctrinal or systematics perspective, provides a lot better way of grappling with this organic community that is to be involved in self-edification.
Yeah. Well, it's often said that we need to have a biblical understanding of everything, and I get that, and I don't want to say that in a proof texting, narrow-minded, ultra-conservative sort of approach to the Bible. It's just, in my view, we need to get our heads around a first century apostolic era view of what the Christian assembly was all about. It's so crucial because if you think about it, 2,000 years have passed since then, and Christianity has also passed through dozens of languages, has passed through thousands of miles, of distance, whether you're in South Africa or in Sweden or in America. It's passed through all these cultures, all these languages, all these miles. And to assume that what we're doing today is exactly what they were doing in the first century is a huge guess that is extremely likely to be flat wrong. And so it becomes imperative for us to get our head around what was going on in the first century. Why did they meet? What did they call it when they met? What is the language that they used to describe the things they did when they got together? And once you do that, then you're finally going to get your head into the right space to be able to assess the assembly. I think one of the big barriers we have, Terry, is our assemblies have become sacred to us. It is, especially if we view it as worship. Nobody wants to think today that they're worshiping God incorrectly. My goodness, that'll send you to hell for sure, right? So nobody wants to think that they're doing it. We already automatically assume that everything that we're doing for God must be correct. God must have, of course, endorse anything that we're doing for him. So we don't want to even question that what we're doing is wrong. But let's get our head back into New Testament mode, get our heads back into first century Christianity mode, and then we can begin to understand what the assembly is all about. And you notice I use that word assembly. I didn't say then we can understand what worship is all about. That's a completely different topic, frankly, if you want to look at it biblically. But we want to get our heads around what the assembly was all about. And it was an assembly back then. This is biblical language. We talk about the word church today. We have this word, and that's a translation of the Greek word ecclesia, right? We all know that one. But even that translation of church is a bit off. But the idea of assembly is more on in terms of a correct and more biblical understanding of what ecclesia is all about. It is an assembly. And the phrase of the Greek words pros erchomai, sunago, coming together, this idea of coming together in a gathering, in a meeting, in an assembly. That's what the first century gatherings were all about. They were not called worship services. They were not called services. Right. They were not called worship. So once you get that basic fact down, then we can begin to have a productive discussion about what we ought to be doing.
Okay, and it's about what we ought to be doing versus what we most often are doing, which has become the sacred cow. And as you mentioned, the moment you touch the sacred cow, I mean, it's over. And for some of us, it's been a very bitter experience, when you are labeled as, who do you think after 2,000 years that you've got it right, But there's not this openness, this willingness to learn, this willingness to be multi-perspectival. Because the moment I get into the one anothering within the body, boy, I'm dealing with multi-perspectives and other people's perspectives that they are either extracting from the text or bringing to the text. And that has been quite a shaker for me in my own understanding. So one of the things I'd really love for you to talk about is, once we get our heads around this idea of the assembly, the biblical assembly, what they did when they got together, right, around the scriptures as a corporate body, what would you say? Where do we go from here? Once we start engaging in understanding that this is a getting together, it's a one anothering exercise where all of us can benefit versus just one, the paid professional, or clerical George, as we call him, is the one that singularly gets the benefit.
Yeah. I think the single most beneficial thought to stick in your head if to understand where we go from here and to try to figure out what first century assemblies were about, the first thought to think about is the venue, the place, the gathering type, where they were. They were not, in the first century, in some sacred building. They were not, in fact, in some building that had rows and rows of pews and stained glass windows and tall spires reaching off the top of the roof and a big cross standing behind some big pulpit at the front. None of that. None of that. We know this, right? This is not surprising to anybody. We know this is true. Rather, what they were in was a home. A house. House churches are mentioned explicitly, clearly in the New Testament, multiple times. There is no question about this. And once you place yourself in that environment, then you can begin to take an appreciation for what they were doing, what they called it. In other words, this is a very relaxed environment in which everybody feels very, very comfortable with one another. They're not staring at the back of somebody's head in some sacred building. Rather, they're looking each other in the face to face, probably sitting around in a circle in a living room, such as they were in the first century at that time. Once you get that together, then you begin to understand all the one anothering references in the New Testament. Encourage one another, teach one another, comfort one another, edify one another, pray for one another, confess your sins to one another. So it's in this familial, relaxed, domestic setting where people are not intimidated by stained glass windows and by holy guys walking up and down the aisles. We're just with our friends in a very comfortable place, and there's probably something cooking in the kitchen at the time, as they would have done back then with their meals, their Lord's Supper, their meal that they had, this agape love feast. So there's also the aroma of food and people gathering together, loving one another. And then there's the one another word again. If you put yourself in that mindset, then you can begin to understand 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, and all the other passages that have some reference to a specific gathering of Christians. I could go on from there, but maybe that just that home environment itself is helpful enough to help us get our head around first century assemblies.
And it's amazing, Tom, isn't it? When people feel safe, when they are relaxed, when they feel secure, it's safe to share. Versus, I would not want to be caught dead on my feet within four walls, talking about some of my struggles that I went through this past week. And so listening to a number of your videos, I also discovered that you're not a purist on the issue of purely it must be house church, right? I think you argue more flexibly that it's the small group encounter that becomes the intimate space, versus this between four walls encounter where we are trying to geolocate God, right? Two very different kind of scenarios. And so I've been very, very intrigued by that, because there's something about home. There's something about that atmosphere. I know some people will spit the moment they hear home because the experience has been so negative with family and home. So maybe for some, home doesn't have that ring to it. But I think generally we understand what is being said, that home atmosphere where it is safe just for me to be me.
Yeah.
But Tom talked to us about some of the pitfalls. Some of us as teenagers were so energetic. We were accused of we were going to bomb the schools, bomb the seminaries, burn the colleges. Because all of this, once you understand assembly in this body life kind of way, right? It's a body, it's organic, it's alive. It basically has a knock-on effect through every single thing you do, all the way from discipleship to training of leaders and seeing people move to maturity. It's got such deep ramifications. So talk to us a bit about what are some of the pitfalls we really need to watch for? Because in our exuberance and excitement, maybe as young pastors when we started out, you know how we go half-cocked, we're going to change the world and take over the world, and we learn, come off with bloody mouths, loss of teeth. And what are some of the things that you would caution us about?
I think even when I first stumbled on this stuff about 50 years ago, I was aware that one of the first problems, if people start to embrace what I'm saying and what Paul is saying, really, one of the first problems is going to be people assuming that we must do things exactly like they did them in the first century. I mean, stop that. Don't do that. But what we need to get a grasp on is why they were doing it. The purpose that they gathered together for is imperative that we learn that. If we miss the very reason why we're supposed to be getting together, all the details aren't going to make much difference. So some people are assuming from what I've been saying that, we must meet in a house. And if you meet in a church building, you're going to hell. Or if since we must meet in a house, then all these church buildings are of the devil and they must be burned down. Well, stop that. Don't do that. That's wrong thinking. That is a serious pitfall. But I think you can have a church building, as we call them, that seats 10,000 people. That's fine. If you've got that kind of money and you've got that many people, you just knock yourself out. That's fine. But if you really, really, really want to grow people, if you really want to grow disciples of Christ, if you really want people to come to maturity, or you really want them to get better next month than they were this month, you're going to have to get things down into a smaller group. Just no other way. Just can't happen. Everybody knew that. Jesus knew that. That's why he started with a group of 12. And he would walk and talk with them, ask questions, let them ask questions, and go back and forth in this kind of a learning environment. This is what the word disciple means, mathetes. It's a learner. We need to have freedom to learn, freedom to ask questions in our gatherings. You can't do that in a big room with 1,000 people. I get it. It's inappropriate. It's not going to be productive. But at sooner or later, and hopefully sooner, you got to break that big group into a small group. And let's say, for example, you've got this big building, you've got 10,000 people, and you're all meeting on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock or whatever. Go ahead and have a big group gathering for 15, 30 minutes or something. But I would suggest break it then into small groups of 20 people each, or 10. Do them somewhere in the various parts of that giant sanctuary you've got, or in some other classrooms, or spread out into homes, or wherever you want to go, out by the riverside. I don't care, but get them in small groups where they each feel free to ask questions and to interact and to love one another, to teach one another, to comfort one another, to get the one anothering thing going. And then you're going to start seeing people grow. Now, mega churches, these big churches, know that this is true. They know that we've got to be breaking things down into small groups if we really want people to learn and grow. They know that. But it's very difficult to do that. And also, once people get accustomed to going to these big gatherings, they're going to check off the box in their mind that they've done what they're supposed to for God this week. Well, I did my worshiping. I don't need to go into this other group and mess with other people. So that's all a problem. People aren't going to be growing if you have that attitude. So you got to get things down, drill down into the small group without condemning anybody else. Don't worry about that. Let God take care of the rest of the stuff. We're not the judge. Let God be the judge. I'm glad he's the judge, and I'm glad I'm not. I don't want the job. Let him do it. I'm sure he's going to do a much better job than I ever will. But just in the meantime, let's get down to building up one another.
And Tom, what I've noticed, having worked, my time in the States of studying, exposed me to, what mega church looks like. And I've often wondered, because what the small group then imitates is exactly what the big group does.
Yeah.
So in a sense, there's no difference between the two in terms of what happens on a Sunday morning and what happens in the small group. It's just you get a little pat on the head. Don't ask too many questions, because I've got chapter 2 of fill in the blank that we need to do together. And, but there's no effort at training those guys, equipping those guys to facilitate this kind of modality that we are talking about. And this is what's really exciting me all over again. That it's what happens in that small group. It's gathering around the scriptures, interacting with the word of God, and allowing the process, as we engage in the process of learning together and one another together, that transformation takes place. And that is so confounding. So one of the things that's really, I would love for us to do, and I know at your age, you'd said at 72, to be up at 1 o'clock in the morning, it's not going to work for me. And I understand that, because I'm just a couple of days away from turning 67. And when you get to where we are at, boy, you wish you had the energy of a 20-year-old. But what a crooked wish to have, right? But our energies are a lot lower. We're not that sharp at remembering and, what's your name again? All this kind of stuff. I've just been so amazed for where you are at, and just how things have, exploded for you at this stage of your life. Talking about doing crowning work at the end of your life. A lot of us want our crowning work at age 22, 23. Doesn't happen for most of us. Yeah, you sit in your 70s and you see this explosion of excitement, over what you've just put together about 2 years ago, if I remember correctly, in terms of that dissertation. But it's really a lifetime of study that you've put together. How are you coping with not just the excitement, but also the challenge that comes off of stewarding that responsibility at this stage of the game?
Well, in some ways, it's ideal to be retired as I am and to be dealing with this attention. There is a lot of attention. I get that. Not all of it is positive, mind you, because there's some people who really don't like me right now. And I get that. I understand that what I'm saying is countercultural. It is, it could be perceived as subversive to the status quo. I get it. I'm not trying to be subversive, but I think the Bible is inherently subversive in a lot of what it's saying, and indeed in first century Christianity and the way they did quote unquote religion was radically different than the surrounding culture, and so ours is radically different as well. So how am I dealing with this stuff? Well, in one ways, I'm very gratified, frankly. After 50 years of encountering a lot of opposition on this topic, it has been very difficult to communicate these things to groups because it does sound so awful. What do you mean you're saying that you can't worship God in church? That sounds like something that Satan would say. So the people accuse me of saying that they just don't get it. But now that I think I did the doctoral work, getting a PhD in New Testament and getting deeper and deeper into the Greek and Hebrew, really began to open up uh, realization for me about why we've gotten things wrong and historically how things drifted so in the second, third, and fourth centuries to get to this system that we still have inherited to this day that is misdirected and is wrong. So anyway, for me today, it's great to finally see some people embracing this stuff. And just to put some numbers on that, Terry, my videos started to take off just 8 months ago, in August of 2024, and since then, and just in those last 8 months, um, I've had over 800,000 views of these videos, and they're
That's
advancing by more than 1,000 every day. It just keeps going on, and I get swamped with questions and comments and emails. The hard part for me is trying to stay on top of it and keep in touch with everybody who's contacting me. And I get daily requests for phone calls and interviews and such. And I'm trying to get as many as I can. Frankly, I'm enjoying talking to people because it helps me even greater understand what it is I'm saying and what it is the Bible is saying. Because when I can bounce it off of other heads on other perspectives, especially you, and from a South African point of view, this this is helpful to me immensely. So I'm embracing these opportunities to talk to people like yourself.
Well, I really got struck by the fact that by your number one, your swift response, because I was expecting a third or a fourth or a fifth party to contact me. And here I get this response. And my immediate reaction was, or my immediate response was, here's a man who probably cares for people. That was my immediate response. Because we are so far south on this continent, you can't go any further. I actually live in Cape Town, which is as far south as you can go to the southwest in South Africa. Theo's over in Sweden, and we've been doing a lot of radio work together. And I just thought, isn't that amazing? He's actually going to be talking to me. And so, two very small questions before you go, Tom. Has there been any other response from folk in South Africa to any of your stuff that you've been presenting here?
Oh, one thing I can do with YouTube, I'm able to drill down the demographics of people who are listening and viewing, and I can break it down not just by country, would break it down by city.
Wow.
And
Okay.
my top 10 cities, now I'm going to get this wrong, but it's generally correct. Uh, yes, probably 6 of them are in the United States. Uh, 3 of them, of the top 10 cities, are in Australia. One of them is in London, but then I've been also surprised somewhere in the top 10 or the top 15 has been like Johannesburg,
Isn't
Cape
that
Town,
something?
Pretoria. Those are popping up. I'm also getting a remarkable response from Nigeria, Kenya,
Interesting. Interesting.
Rwanda. I didn't expect this. I'm actually learning my geography finally, thanks to this kind
I
of
can well
response.
believe that. Like all the world in Texas, for example. Yeah, I mean, most Americans think that's where it ends, you know. But I would really love to, just to have that kind of contact with some of, of those who are closer to me and, watch how this dialogue is continuing to explode. So maybe if you would, Tom, I would love that you drill down on some of those and just let us have some of that info if that's at all possible. I guess it's hard for you to say, well, it's Joe Blow or it's John Doe in a particular location, right? That would be a lot tougher,
Um,
wouldn't it?
the Now, one thing that my YouTube analytics do not do is drill that down to a specific person. However, I've received over 10,000 comments and emails. Not all of those are emails. Some of those are comments, but the emails usually identify the country and the name of the person. And I've got I've just started collecting those a couple of months ago, and now I've got about 1,000 of those. And I
Wow.
can actually find names, put names like I would find Terry Martin's name in the list because you responded to me,
That's
and
right.
you went
Yeah.
to my website to
Yep.
respond, and it's those people who are finding my website, which I'm not actually making that widely known. I don't mention that much in my
I
videos,
haven't
but
heard
people
you
are
do it.
finding it.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and so it's even more amazing that I'm getting that many responses to my website because they had to search to find it and then
Yes.
find the
Yes.
contact page and then they go through the effort of typing me a message. And so it's because I know that they've done that work. I'm happy to respond to those folks who have gone to that much effort just to get a hold of me.
Tom, I would appreciate a couple of those contacts and really just, get in touch with what's happening on this side because both Theo and I are very aware. Sometimes you feel like you this lone voice, You feel like Elijah felt, There's no one else around, and then only to discover there's 7,000 that haven't bent the knee. And Theo is my conscience on that because he would always say, we just don't know who they are. So I would really covet some of that info and, try and get down to these guys because it's amazing to see just how things have exploded for you. I mean, with our radio station, I've now, I've got about 130 podcasts that I've put down um, on radio, and they come down as podcasts. So not only for radio, which is audio, but also on YouTube. And so that's opened up a whole new scenario for me that I never thought was possible. And so we'd love to have further collaboration with you. Now, here's the final question. I would love to pick your brain on how could we get further or engage in further collaboration around this topic of what is the assembly? What is it supposed to be doing? What's the goal? What's the telos? What's its ultimate goal? And how do we get there? And to be involved in that kind of dialogue, not just locally in this country, but also even internationally, and particularly with you as one of the dialoguing persons, within that arena. And if you've thought through that some, or what your thoughts on that would be.
Yeah, Terry, I've gotten a disturbing number of people who have contacted me who say, Tom, do you know of a house church in my area? I got one just last week of somebody who is in Adelaide, Australia. They said, Tom, do you know of a house church? And, I've never been to Adelaide. I've never been to Australia. I don't know anybody anywhere, but they wanted to know. But as it turned out, I looked back in my records, and sure enough, I'd had other responses from specific people in Adelaide, Australia. And I was able to share with her an email address. And I don't know what'll happen there, but there are a number of people around the globe who are looking for a smaller gathering. And they often ask for a house church. It's not necessary that it be a house church, but I think it needs to be a small group of some kind. And I would dare say that, let's say somebody is going to church right now somewhere, and maybe the church has 100 people. Well, you look within your own church and find some people with whom you identify, you have relationship with, and begin to meet with them. Don't disturb at all your present commitment to your existing church, but start to meet personally with each other on a regular basis, maybe at a restaurant, maybe in one of your homes, maybe in a church classroom, wherever it is, but then start to have edifying gatherings. And that goes to your other question you've been asking, well, what does that look like? Or that we can get into that. But that's what I suggest people do, though. Just try to find like-minded people in your own community, and they're out there. And if you're already circulating in some sort of Christian circles, like in a church circle of some sort, find them there and then begin to meet. What's important, folks, what's important is that we build up one another, that we become stronger Christians, not weaker ones, that our faithfulness and that our ties and loyalty to Jesus become stronger and not weaker. I fear that some of our modern church conventions are actually not producing stronger Christians, and they're disillusioning a lot of people in many ways. That doesn't need to happen that way, but what we not got to do is build up one another, and it happens in small groups. So go find them, folks. They're out there. They're in your area.
Okay.
I'll do whatever I can to help you, but man, dude, I got nothing here.
Well, pass on a couple of names. That'll be fine. But
Yeah.
I just appreciate your encouragement. Your encouragement to start where you are. And we have a captive audience in more ways than one. Theo and I have been buddies for almost 45 years, and we started out in the pastorate together, and so we've walked a very long road together. And just the encouragement to start where you are. He's in a local church in Sweden where he's been doing some phenomenal things in a Sunday worship service, and we can leave that for another day. I suggest we leave that discussion for another day. But he's really been, whatever I learn, I pass on to Theo, right? I preach it and he practices it. So that's the way we have functioned. But Tom, we really appreciate your time here and would like down the road, again, when there's a little window, even if it's just a 10, 15-minute window, it's fine. We work with a lot smaller blocks. We try not to go for these 1 hour, 2 hour kind of scenarios. Even our radio show, just 15, 20 minutes. That's where we pitch. So we really appreciate your time and the effort that you've put in to talk to us way on the other side of the world. And may God bless you in your endeavors for him at this latest stage of your life. We're not going to say late. We're just going to say latest stage of your life. And thank you for encouraging our hearts, Tom. We really appreciate it. God bless you.
Let me say that, and I mean this with all sincerity, you contact me anytime, and let's connect again as often as you like. And with a long list of topics, that we can discuss that we have not been able to address here.
Sure.
But my door and my email address is always open to you at any time. So Terry, God bless your ministry, what you're doing for people in Cape Town and throughout South Africa. I wish you the absolute best.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for your time. God bless you real good. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Theo, for being
bye-bye. Sure.
behind the scenes.
Not a problem.
God bless.
Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Sure.
Bye.